somebody wave or throw a shoe? Thank you, sir. All right, good. I won't worry so much about it. What I want to talk about tonight, I call it, I made it up. I call it spiritual insanity. One of the great things about pastoring a church is you get to watch people. And after 20, 30, 40 years, I don't know how long, you start picking up things where you see things in people's lives. And I have a little bit of experience. My wife always likes when I say this because she says, amen, real loud, when I say I have a little bit of experience with insanity. My mother, 2 times, family members had to come in and rescue me, my brothers and sisters, and they would take my mother and put her in an asylum for a while until she could get right back on her feet. Her problem was physical pain. She just had so much physical pain, she couldn't take it, and she learned how to just flip this little switch inside of her head, and the pain disappeared. But the problem with that was she didn't know her husband, my father, us kids. She didn't know anything. She was out of it. And little by little, I started noticing it, and it seems like it's really prevalent in churches. But you have people that are just not in this world. I'm having trouble explaining this, but it's like they just shift into another world. And it's like insanity is like when you leave reality and you run to a safe place where you're safe and quiet and nobody can touch you. And I always wondered why most of the time in the average church, about 80% of all the people in the church don't do anything. And about 20% of all the people in the church do everything. And it's like there's people in a church from time to time you'll go, and if an evangelist comes in and he talks about and he says, let's look at all and everybody's tithing records, and everybody goes, no. Let's everybody look at witnessing, and everybody goes, no, we don't want to do that. And there just seems like there's a time in Christians' lives when they sit in the pew and they kind of turn everything off and they hide from responsibility. You don't see that so much in the world. I have been in dealerships, in doctors' offices, and I see sweet young ladies or older ladies or gentlemen come in and they're bent out of shape and they're mad at the doctor, and boy, they just rant and rave and speak and holler and do all of this. But when people come into church, they just are quiet and demure, and they can't do anything, and they can't speak, and they can't talk. And I don't know how to describe it, but I think that's a problem in our churches. And what I want to give to you tonight is 4 symptoms of insanity in churches. And there's something that is keeping us from being what God wants us to be. There's something that's just robbing us from being bold. Tonight, if you wanted to talk about pickup trucks, I would choose the side of Ford. I've owned 6. And I could talk to you for hours. And you find people that have things they like to talk about. But when it comes to witnessing or something about the Lord, it just seems that everybody's so quiet and they think that's normal. Am I just kind of flying around here loose, or do you all understand what I'm trying to say? All right. And so that's what I want to look at. I see it now in John chapter 4, and that's what I want to look at. Now, let's just look at John chapter 4, and we'll work through the first 20-some verses. I wish in John chapter 4, the Lord had kind of waited until we could get a video of this. John chapter 4 is the woman at the well. And I would have given anything if I had a video of Jesus sitting at the well and letting the woman of the well come, and Jesus looks at her and he starts to talk to her, and he talks to her about living water, and he talks about the well, and if you take of the living water, you'll never thirst again. And I wish I could see the expression on the face of Jesus, the expression on the woman's face. This is one of the greatest miracles in the Bible because someone has their life changed. They're born again. They realize this is the Messiah, and they accept the Lord with all of their heart. And I like it because not only this, but you look at what Jesus overcame when he won this lady. And I wrote down just a couple of things. He overcame gender because Jewish men are not supposed to talk to ladies. He overcame race. She was a Samaritan and he was a Jew. What's a Jew talking to a Samaritan? He overcame culture. It wasn't in their culture that they could meet and talk, and yet he did it. It was over religion. She had her religion and where she worshiped. And Jesus covered that. And then it covers sin. And Jesus talks about sin. So in about 20 minutes, Jesus sits with this woman. And he overcomes all of those obstacles, and he brings her to that point that she believes he's the Messiah. And in our terminology, she's saved. She's born again, and she believes in Jesus. That is the greatest thing that can ever happen. And if you've ever led anybody to the Lord, you know that feeling. In the 70s, I think it was, I had a bus route in Pittsburgh. And I was helping someone else on the bus route, and we were visiting, and I came to this house, and people were moving in. And so I went up to this lady, and I said, my name is Rick McLean. I'm assistant pastor at I forget the name of the church. Baptist Church, Allison Park, Pennsylvania. And she looked at me funny, and I said, we offer free bus transportation to church. And I said, we offer bus transportation to church. And she said, you're kidding me. And I go, no. She said, what do you charge? And I said, it's free. And she said, who all do you take? I said, anybody breathing. Even if they're not breathing, we'll take them. And she said, she was so excited. And she said, well, my best friend and I, our husbands left us. And we didn't know what we were going to do. And so we rented this house, and we moved into this house with our kids. And there were 9 of them. And it was like 2 ladies and 5 teenagers and 2 or 3, however you come up with 9, younger kids. And she said, we would love to go. And man, I was tickled to death. So for about a month and a half, I'd visit every week. And finally I came by on a Saturday, and she said, Brother Rick, come in, we have to talk to you. And I went and I sat down with her, and she said, we all have a question. And I said, okay. She said, I've been hearing the pastor preach all this time, and he keeps talking about being saved. And I have no idea, we have no idea what you're talking about. Could you explain to us what being saved is? And I go, well, sure. So I get out a Bible, and I start explaining. She goes, whoa, 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 whoa. All of us want to know. And I said, what do you mean all of us? She said, all of us. And she got all the 9 of them. She got all the teenagers, the other lady, the kids, and they all sat down. And in about 20, 30 minutes, I led 9 people to the Lord. And the next week they got baptized and got into the church. Now, how long has that been? 1972 to today. I can't count that good. And it's still like the greatest day of my life. Now, what I want you to see, John chapter 4, starting in verse 27. Now understand, Jesus just led the woman of the well to the Lord. And then verse 27 begins. And upon this came his disciples, and marveled that he talked with the woman. Yet no man said, what seekest thou, or why talkest thou with her? The woman then left her water pot, and went her way to the city, and saith to the men, come see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ? Then they went out of the city, and came unto him. In the meanwhile his disciples prayed him, saying, Master, eat. But he said unto them, I have meat to eat that ye know not of. Therefore said the disciples one to another, hath any man brought him aught to eat? Jesus saith unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. Say not ye that there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest? Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes, and look on the fields, for they are white, already to harvest. Now, have you ever been in a group, and everything's going real good, and something's taking place, and everybody's in sync, and then somebody walks in and just kills it? Has that ever happened to anybody here? Only 4 of us. All right, you know what I'm talking about. That's what happened in John chapter 4. The disciples were so far out of it. I'm ashamed of these disciples. Because when they come back, they're standing watching Jesus, and they marveled. They marveled that Jesus was talking to this woman. And they standed there watching. And, I mean, how should have they acted? How should they have felt? What should they have said? In our days, we would have gone over and gave her a hug and say, man, we're excited and we're happy for you. You've just been saved. And here the disciples who live with Jesus stand back and they're looking and they're marveling and say, what in the world is he doing talking to that woman? To me, that's spiritual insanity. Where are you at? What are you doing? I've preached in churches where sometimes I wonder if the people sitting in the church are really saved. You watch people get involved in things and you're wondering, where in the world did they get all of this? Sometimes I just don't know where people are coming from, and that's what my problem with the disciples. Now I want to give you 4 things very quickly. To me, are symptoms that I see in the disciples of this religious insanity. Number 1, when you watch the disciples, they're constantly preoccupied with self. Every time you see the disciples, they're thinking, talking, worried about themselves. When you see them in this chapter, they're thinking about food. I have 3 things, and I wrote them down because they all began with F, and it was easy for me to remember. I said that once, and the words really didn't start with the same letter, so I have to be careful with that. The first one is food. Their appetites. And it is amazing how many of us come to church, and when we sit in church, 99% of all of our thoughts are on us. I have to admit, there are times I've sat in church and I wonder what I'm going to have for lunch. I like getting my body and my system in gear beforehand. And amazing, during the week you walk around and you're driving and you're thinking, and we're thinking about ourselves. It's that religious insanity. The Bible is reality. The Holy Spirit is reality. What we do for Jesus in this church is reality. Everything out there doesn't really matter. What did the Lord say? Don't take thought of what you eat or what you wear or what you do. That's all taken care of. We think about our appetites. Number 2, they thought about fellowship. Now, I know this sounds hard, but when you see the disciples, they would go to Jesus and they would say, please, please, stay with us. And loving Jesus would say, what have I got to do with you? I didn't come for you. Hello? I didn't come to sit and hold your hand. I came for them. And the disciples were so wrapped up in fellowship that they were good for nothing. They were in their own world. They criticized Jesus because he ate with sinners. And then last, food, fellowship, and last, fame. You won't believe this, but you know what the favorite pastime for the disciples was? Arguing amongst themselves who was the greatest. The disciples. I'm better than you. I'm going to sit at the right hand of Jesus. And so here you see people that are responsible for taking the gospel into all the world, the people that Jesus picked, the disciples that know Jesus better than anybody else, and they're spending all of their time about their appetites, their fellowship, and their fame. And they've missed everything that Jesus tried to teach. Number two, they were bothered with people. Spiritual insanity. When we Christians sit in church and we're bothered by people. Oh, it's all right if people come and it's all right if they get saved, but I don't want to get too close. I mean, yes, we want lost people to come, and we want people of all shades and colors, and we want people that are poor, and we want all people like this, but I'm not going to get too close. Now, don't look at me at the wrong way, all right? I'm more of an evangelist than a pastor, and sometimes it comes out a little hard, but it's the truth. I used to travel, and I would be in a different church, one or two different churches every week for 10 years. And when I'd be off in the East Coast or Maine or somewhere, I'd take the guys working with me, and every Sunday, every Wednesday night, we would go to church, and we'd be in a different church. And I cannot tell you how many churches we were in where no one. And I would always find a Baptist church. We would sit in the Baptist church and no one even looked at us. I'm going to give you a statistic you won't believe. I could name some of the greatest Baptist churches in America that I've been in for 1 or 2 weeks. And in 10 years, only one person ever asked me about my soul. I would live in the church and sleep on the pews and work, and the staff and the pastor and church people would come by, and I would install pews in the churches, and I'd be there for 2 weeks, and they would take me out and feed me, and oh, we're happy to have you here and all of this. But in 10 years, only one preacher ever asked me about my soul. Southern Baptist preacher in Greenville, South Carolina. And I was getting my paper signed, and he looked at me and he put his head down and he said, I'm sorry. He said, I made a deal with the Lord. I don't get out much, but I made a promise to the Lord that nobody would get in my church without me asking them about their soul. And I broke down crying. And he said, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to embarrass me. He said, you don't understand. I'm a pastor and a preacher, and I do this on the side, and no one has ever, you're the first. You're the only. Too many times we don't really care about people. It's messy. They're a bother. I won't get involved. They're an interruption. It's difficult. Lost people are messy. Lost people have difficult lives. Lost people have problems. Lost people need love and help. And it never dawned on the disciples. Number 3, they never paid attention to Jesus. This is my hardest. I grew up with a dad who didn't know how to be a dad. His father died when he was 12. And my dad never took me anywhere, never did anything with me. All he knew was a nice belt down on the basement stairs to try to keep me straight. And one day in my self-righteousness, I was probably 12 or 13, and I'm yelling at him. I said, Dad, I don't understand all of your rules, and you tell me to act this way here and that way. It was just a bunch of baloney, but I was trying to get heard. And my dad had a great wisdom that he gave me. He said, son, if you're ever in doubt about the rules, just look at my face. He said, all you got to do is look at my face and you'll tell right offhand whether I'm mad or I'm happy. Now let me ask you something. If you were one of the disciples and you were living with Jesus, you were following Jesus. You went with Jesus everywhere he went. Couldn't you read and tell? I have three things. One, they never listened to his words. Every now and then I'll be reading and they'll remember when Jesus died on the cross, what did the disciples do? But have you ever read in the Bible where he sat down with them and told them, I've got to go to Jerusalem, and there I'll be taken up and crucified? He sat down with them and told them. And I see so many churches running around and I'm wondering, are they paying attention to what Jesus said? Are they listening to his words? They get all hyper and they're running around and I go, when did Jesus ever tell you to do that? I don't see it. Then I don't think they ever looked at his face. You read the Bible and Jesus comes and he sits down and he looks at Jerusalem and he weeps. And he wants to gather Jerusalem. He's walking down a road and he sees lepers. And he turns and he touches them and he heals them. He sees sinners and tax collectors and he goes to their house and he talks to them about the scriptures. Everything Jesus did on this earth, he was concerned for people. And he said, I've come to seek and to save that which is lost. And yet the disciples sit there and say, they marveled, what is he doing with that woman? Where have you been? Hello? If Jesus was with us tonight, if Jesus walked around with you during the week, what do you think in his heart and soul he would want you to do? Spiritual insanity. Come on, smile. Make me at least, all right? We just shut it off and go, no, I don't know. What was it that Jesus did? Everything he did was to reach and to love and to talk to someone. Am I right? And they never understood what he was doing. They watched him and it never dawned on them what they were doing, what he was doing. And then last, and I'm done, most important, they missed the harvest. They missed the harvest. They were disciples following Jesus, and they knew nothing about the harvest. They were trying to be the type of Christian. They were trying to be the type of follower because they were proud of how they were acting and how they were living, and they were arguing over who was the greatest. They were trying to live that life, but they knew nothing about the harvest that Jesus was trying to draw. When they looked at this woman, they saw a sinner. They saw a sinner that had no value. When they saw this sinner, they believed that they had greater value to Jesus than the woman did. Hello? They thought they were more important. They never saw the woman. This woman got more in 20 minutes than they did in 2 years. Hello? This woman got more in 20 minutes than they did in 2 years. 20 minutes with Jesus, she gets up. The disciples come and freeze her out. She leaves her water pot and she goes into the town, and every single person she meets, she says, come, you need to see this man who told me everything that I am. This must be the Messiah. You read on in the next couple of verses, and what it talks about, all of these people came and they said, now we come, we believe in Jesus, not because of what you said, but we believe in Jesus because we've heard him ourselves. This woman reached her city. And the disciples were oblivious to it because they never saw the woman. In the 90s, I was pastoring in upstate New York, and one night, on a Wednesday night, we had a youth center with a gymnasium and a kitchen and all different things for teenagers. And my youth director came to me and he said, Pastor, he said, I've got a man here, and we just led his teenage son to the Lord. And he wants to talk to you. He's not sure what took place with his son. And I said, sure. His name was Lou, a very good friend. And Lou came in, and I sat down and opened the Bible, and I showed him how his son got saved. And Lou said, I remember when I was a teenager, I did that at a youth camp up in the Adirondacks, and I remember being saved. And I said, that's what happened to your son. And we rejoiced and hugged, and he was excited. He was growing in the Lord. 2 weeks later, I get a call from Lou, and he says, Pastor, I have a problem. I said, okay. My wife does not understand what's going on. She thinks you're a cult. Everybody was Catholic. Can you come to my house and explain to my wife what it is to be saved? I said, sure. So I go into this little house, and the furniture is all wobbly, and off in the corners, this little short woman, it's dark, and she's got long black hair, and she's in this shadow, and she's a chain smoker, and she just chain smoking away like crazy. So I called her by name, and I said, come over here, sit at the table, and I want to tell you what happened to your son and your husband. So I took about 15, 20 minutes, and I told her about being saved, and I said, would you like to be saved? And she's shaking her head, and I said, well, I figured, well, maybe I didn't explain it right. So I went back and I explained it all again a little bit better. When I was done, I said, would you like to be saved? She's shaking her head, and I called her by name, and I said, what's wrong? What don't you understand? God is my witness. She said, Pastor, she said, I understand it all. The problem is, it's not that I don't understand it. It's just that God would never save someone like me. Till this little light goes on in my head. So I took her to John chapter 4. And we go through what Jesus said to the woman at the well. And it dawned on her, this little light came on her, that it didn't matter. We're all sinners. And she accepted the Lord. Then she looked at me and she said, Pastor, she said, my father started abusing me when I was 12. And at age 16, I ran off with the first boy that would take me. He was a dope dealer. And he put me into prostitution. I got pregnant. And I came home one day when I was 18, and he had hung himself. I found his body in the closet. And she proceeded to tell me about her life until the age that she was now. And every Friday night, she and her girlfriend would rent a limousine, and they would go down to this bar in Johnstown, New York, and drink until they couldn't walk, and they would throw them in the limousine, and the limousine would take them home. And that's how she had lived for 20-some years. But she got saved. Now, when I went to New York, the church was running about 40 people. It used to run 600. When this young lady got saved, the community didn't know what hit it. I was in the bank cashing a check from the church, and I felt hot breath on my shoulder, and I looked up. And this lady was looking over my shoulder at my check. Now, most of the time, you're your pastor. What does it matter? Everybody knows what your check says anyway. So I looked at her, and she looked straight into my eyes, and she called this lady's name, and she said, "Are you?" And she called this lady's name, "Are you her pastor?" And I go, "Yes." And she turned white, and she backed away from me like this and left the bank. And in a matter of 9 months, we grew from like 40 people to 220. People were getting saved every single Sunday. The choir had people out of prison, people out of prostitution. God just opened the doors and poured out heaven. The miracle in that church was not me. The miracle in that church was that young lady. The average church, the greatest soul winner that you're going to have is somebody that's not saved yet. Chances are it will not be you. Because you've already been here all these years and it hasn't worked, it hasn't changed, you're still the same. And the problem is we're like the disciples. We go to the gas station and we're pumping gas and a guy comes up beside us and on the other side and looks at us. We kind of go, hey. We go to the grocery store and there's people in front of us and people behind us and they're getting groceries and we go, hey. And they could be that lady. And notice what Jesus says to the disciples. And this is why I want a video of it. He goes, hey, wake up. Open up your eyes. Look, the fields are white. They're sitting there, they're around you, they're all over the place. And you don't notice. That's spiritual insanity. That's what the disciples were doing. How many here tonight will say, Brother Rick, I do not want to miss that lady again. I don't want to miss the souls that are white and ready to harvest anymore. If I go to a gas station or the bank or a grocery store or wherever I go to the park, anybody I talk to, I want to make sure that I don't pass them by and judge them and think myself better than they are. We had a young man named James Intellisano. He was just out of prison. I was preaching one Sunday morning and enjoying myself, and I'm walking around and I keep hearing this guy laughing at me. And I get kind of, there's a word that says belligerent. I get kind of mad every now and then, so I'm thinking, I'm going to find this guy that's laughing at me, and I want to give him a piece of mind, and I'm right in the middle of the sermon. So I'm walking around preaching, and all at once I see it. It's James. He's a visitor. James is about 6'4", about 280. More muscles on him than I have ever seen on anybody in my life. So in wisdom, I said, he can laugh all he wants. That's fine. James was dating with one of the young ladies in the church. In fact, he was living with her. James got saved. And he came to me one day, and we were, just a whole lot, but he came to me one day, and he came to our house, and he said, Pastor, he said, you were preaching once, and you said something, and I'm not sure it's exactly what you meant. And I said, well, what did I say? And he said, you were preaching, and you said, sometimes the Lord will talk to you. Not in a verbal, but you know in your heart and your soul that he's saying something to you. And he said, how do I know that God is saying this to me? And I said, well, tell me what you think he said first. And he said, well, in my old days, and he's lived in this town forever, he said, in my old days, I used to get mad, and he said, they sent me to prison for it, but he said, I used to hurt people. And I said, well, I can believe that. And he said, but God has been talking to me and says, since I'm saved, he wants me to go to those people and ask for forgiveness. And I said, James, I really believe that's God talking to you. And so James took off, and that week he went to all of these people that he had beat up and crippled and put in the hospital. And the next Sunday he came by, and I said, James, how did it go? He said, it was great. He said, all but this one guy, and he wouldn't pull over, and he said, I ran him off the road, and I pulled him out. It's serious. Yeah, I ran him off the road, and I pulled him out of the car, but when he understood what I was trying to say, I said, what did he do? He said, he just kind of froze. Ladies and gentlemen, that is people with the power of God on them. People that see the gospel and know, and they're saved, and they're proud of the Lord Jesus, and they want to see other people saved. And they're people like that. The Bible is true. The field is white. But we don't see the woman. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for your word. Father, I pray that we never go someplace in this world where we see somebody for the first time, somebody we've never met, somebody we don't know. Father, I pray we never see that person and not think, here is a lost soul that I need to witness to. Father, help us to wake up and to be what you've called us to be. We ask it in your precious name. Amen. Pastor Dan.